Welcome to everybody. I'm Jeremy. I am the director of the honors program at SVA and a sociologist. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Art and Politics lecture series tonight. Just a little bit about the series, and then I'll introduce our very honored speaker. The series, just to briefly read the description, humanity is living through an interlocking series of crises. It is difficult to say strongly enough how urgent the situation is. How do these conditions impact the arts? Does art have resources that might come to our aid in these serious times? And what is to be done? In light of all there is to understand and change, SVA's Art and Politics lecture series is co-hosted by the honors program as well as BFA Visual and Critical Studies at SVA. And we invite people from all stripes, walks of life, scholars, academics, artists, curators, activists, and more to address and to discuss, debate art, politics, and the delicate filaments that tie them together. So that's our series generally. We have one more lecture this semester on Thursday, December 2nd. That will be both in person and online. It will be a hybrid event. And that's with Judith Stein, the art historian, speaking about her book, Eye of the 60s, on Richard Bellamy, the art dealer, and the transformation of modern art and the rise of the contemporary art market. That's on December 2nd. Tonight, I have the honor and just thrill of welcoming back to SVA, however, virtually, as is still somewhat our want in these strange times. Frances Fox Piven. Frances is a distinguished political sociologist. For people who know her work, it needs no introduction, but I'll say for people who don't know her work, her books are definitive on key aspects and questions of social movements, voting, and welfare and American democracy. Her book, Regulating the Poor, is on the welfare state. Her book, Poor People's Movements, is one of the definitive accounts of social movements and how they make change. Her book, Why Americans Don't Vote, as well as a more recent volume, Keeping Down the Black Vote, Race and the Demobilization of American Voters, are important to contemporary questions and debates around voter participation. And indeed, I don't know, there are many of us that can really say we inspired and helped make a law happen, but that book, Why Americans Don't Vote, helped make Motor Voter Act into law. And finally, in a recent volume, Challenging Authority, How Ordinary People Change America, she synthesized many of these themes, a book well worth checking out. I think I sent around one of the chapters on movements. And yeah, I could just keep going on about Fran and her inspiration. I should also say that we've been lucky to have her here over several years, come to SVA and talk to us about the changing political situation. And boy, what an interesting few years it's been. And so just for making sense of everything that's happening in the United States and in the world, she has been indispensable. And so I'm honored to have her with us. I think how tonight will generally go is she'll talk for a while. She and I will bat it back and forth for a little while. I'm actually teaching a class on democracy this semester, so being able to talk to her about democracy and its discontents and kind of the state of democracy more generally is quite exciting and an honor for me. And my students will no doubt hear things I've talked to them about before many a time. And then we'll have time for Q&A and go till about 7:30 together. Without further ado, I will give the mic to Frances. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Jeremy. And I want to say that for the last few years, I've been speaking to people at the School for the Visual Arts, usually about the time of the election. And I'm glad to be back, although I'm not very glad about the subject matter that we're going to discuss today, because it's been a very depressing and a kind of amazing time in American politics. I cannot recall in my own lifetime a series of events such as we've gone through in the last few years. Two kinds of changes have occurred. One quite amazing. I think any political scientist would agree with me. One, that it is amazing that there is this uproar questioning the legitimacy of the last presidential election. A political party, we only really have two political parties, a political party has risen up to cast doubt on what is a kind of foundational political process in the country. At the same time, that political party, the Republican Party, has, particularly in state fora, has been moving very rapidly and very aggressively to make voting more difficult on the grounds that the last election was a fraudulent election. We've never had an experience like this in my lifetime. We've had bad experiences. And if you go back further in history, we've had amazing experiences, but this is something new. So because what is happening is that there is this massive challenge by there are only two political parties that matter. One of those parties is launching a massive challenge against a right, a political right, which all political analysts would agree is foundational to democracy. The right to vote has now been, it's being scrutinized. We have funny companies like Cyber Ninja recounting the vote here and there. We have all sorts of loudmouths claiming that wild and illegitimate things went on during the last election. And then we have organized and systematic efforts to make it more difficult to vote on the grounds that by making it more difficult to vote, we will make the vote more transparent, more legal, more legitimate. So what does this mean? How should we think about it? And ultimately, we have to decide what we can do, if anything. And in order to appreciate how significant this attack on democratic rights is, I think we have to stop for a moment and ponder the significance of democracy itself, of the democratic idea, which has been around for a couple of centuries. And I think it's fair to say that it is the most inspirational idea in the modern era, that people are gripped by this idea of democracy, which, what is it consistent? It's the idea that the people, the public, the many have to agree with the government, or the government has to stop. That's the idea, that what the government does has to depend on approval by all of us, the many. That idea, I said it was inspirational, the most inspirational idea in the modern era. And I think I can back that up by pointing to the incredible struggles that the idea has inspired among ordinary people who usually sort of just wake up and struggle for bread or for money to pay the mortgage, but that idea that we have to consent to what the government does. That the government which is the seat of military power, the government which is the seat of legal authority, the government has to be approved by us. That idea is so gripping and so inspiring that it has for several centuries now been the goad for massive struggles by people for democracy, for arrangements which are thought about, which are understood as ensuring that the people agree before the government acts. We saw struggles like this, remarkably intelligent and well-informed struggles in the Chartist movement in England, for example. And of course, I want to talk about this in a moment, the Revolutionary War struggles in the United States were very much colored by the idea that independence from Britain would mean that democracy would be empowered, that democracy would prevail in the United States. So, but this idea, which gripped ordinary people, also gripped elites, or rather the reverse of the idea gripped elites. The democratic idea became the focus of deep and bitter conflicts because democracy was a challenge to the control by elites of the state apparatus, of its military force and its legal authority. And for several centuries now, this conflict over the control of the state by the many, by us, by all of us, or by elites has been central to the politics of our country and many countries across the globe. So, and those conflicts, by the way, have motivated people to do incredible things, incredible things. When I think about this, I always remember the period in Haiti when Papa Doc, the military ruler of Haiti at the time, was challenged by a democratic rival, a democratic insurgent, and ordinary people, Haitians, stood on lines to vote for Aristide, to vote for their candidate, and braved the military, the Tantan Makuts, they were called. Ordinary people stood up to the military force behind the rulers of Haiti. And this happened fairly recently, but we see it all over the world and throughout history. And we saw it also during the period of the American Revolution, which we always think of as a kind of colonial revolution, an effort by the colonists in the United States to free themselves from British rule. But that effort to get free of the British crown was inflamed by the idea of democracy, because people thought of the conflict not only as a colonial conflict to sever the ties with the British government and the British elites, but they thought of the conflict also as an effort to bring democracy to the colonies. And if you if you read the histories of the turmoil that beset the colonies before the Revolutionary War actually erupted, it is clear that people thought of the struggle as a struggle for democracy. So have we, over the centuries since then, have we won that struggle? Has there been, or has there at least been progress in the struggle? Now I think that we have to acknowledge that there are dual and contradictory trends in our history. In one way, we have won democratic rights. With the right to vote seems to have expanded since the 1776, since the eruption of the American Revolutionary War. At the same time, the actual exercise of the right to vote has not expanded. So there's a kind of peculiar pattern in American history. We win successive expansions of democratic rights, and especially the right to vote. And at the same time, something is going on that rolls back in actual life, in what people do, what they can do. When they go to the ballot box, something happens to restrict the right to vote. I think that's a reflection of the intensity of the struggle over the right to vote, the struggle between the many and the struggle between elites. So that you see, for example, after the American Revolution, for the first few decades of the 19th century, the right to vote expands in the United States. More and more people are formally allowed to vote, and we celebrate that. That's the way the history of American democracy is told. The foundational right gradually but definitely expands. But at the same time, that right in practice is always undermined from the very beginning. All sorts of procedures are introduced to make it harder to vote, even while formally the right to vote expands. That property, what does that mean? It means that, for example, property requirements are reduced, but voter registration requirements are increased, or educational requirements are introduced, even while religious requirements may be eliminated. So this is the result of the fact that the right to vote is a foundational right. It does matter in what the state does and what government does. And it is constantly, always contested. So that what has been happening in the last years in the United States, what has so amazed close observers, the outrage at organized Republicans trying to make it harder to vote, trying to make it illegal for people to get water while they're waiting online to vote, trying to shorten the period of time that when voting can go on. The outrage at all of this is outrage at a conflict really that has been with us from the very beginning of the United States, from the very beginning of our country. So the conflict was very intense at the beginning during the Revolutionary War. it welled up again, the conflict over the right to vote. But it was a two-sided conflict. There was enough energy and animation among the rank and file who had fought for the revolution that you could not simply deny the right to vote. And the constitutions of the 13 colonies did not deny the right to vote. That the constriction of the right to vote had to be worked on. It had to be inserted into the procedures. It had to be hidden. It had to have to do with residence requirements or property requirements were eliminated because they were so transparently elite protecting. But the kinds of procedures that have been multiplying in the states in the last few years, which make it shorten the time that you can vote, for example, or require that deny the right of people to offer water or food to people waiting online, or intimidate local election officials or state election officials. Those procedures have been with us from the beginning, and we have to fight to roll them back because there are always the efforts of elites to narrow the electorate, to keep some groups out of the electorate because they will challenge elite control of the state and the way in which elite control of the state protects the property, protects those who are rich, and so on. So in American history, there have been several periods in which this conflict between the many and the rich and the property has welled up. First, during and after the Revolutionary War. Second, as the conflict between the North and the South, partly over slavery, but also over the organization of the economy, this conflict unfolded over a period of several decades before it erupted in the Civil War. Notice that after the Civil War, there was a period that was called the New Birth of Freedom, when the Constitution was amended, and the most important amendment gave African Americans, gave the slaves the right to vote, the foundational right in any democracy. The next period when the right to vote and the struggle for democracy erupted was within the Democratic Party, and the issue had to do with labor rights, with the right to strike, for example. And then there was the recurrence, the resurgence really of the race issue and the associated issues of economic organization with the civil rights movement. So those are probably the highlights of the struggle for democracy in American history. So where are we now? In a certain sense, all of these conflicts are erupting again. We're again fighting a race war over the right to vote. We're again fighting a right to vote or a right to democracy for organized labor. We're again fighting a fight over democracy and other marginalized groups and especially the poor people in the United States. So what are the prospects for winning this war for good? Can we win it for good? What do you think, Jeremy?
Give me the easy question, yeah. No, probably. For good? For good? I mean, yeah, what is that? Eternal vigilance is required.
Well, of course, eternal vigilance, but I think we're at a turning point or a crisis point in American political development. The elements in the crisis have to do in large part, but not entirely, with the attack on foundational democratic rights. They also have to do with the unleashing, really, of very aggressive demands by corporate America. I call them the property class because I was a little bit taken by the sort of 18th century that I was thinking of, but it's corporate America that is thriving by an attack on democracy. That's something that we never really expected. I don't think we ever expected a bold, transparent attack on democracy under the banner of corporate leadership. And that's what's happening right now. And another element that is very strange to us, or it seems strange, maybe we have to look more closely at our history, is the rise of cultism in a way that I can't recall. And that means that people are susceptible to interpretations of what's going on that don't depend on their own experience. They learn about cabals that eat children and things like that, and they're ready to believe them. This is very, very, to me, it's very, very strange and very alarming. If only because the most elemental understanding of what democracy permits and requires is that people have to be able to assess what they need and whether government is doing what they need it to do. And if they can't, if they just believe crazy stories, I don't know what happens. So
I mean, I think you're pointing to like the relationship between what we might call sort of more ordinary or kind of rule following anti-democratic activity of like the last 40 years, the neoliberal period. Like, so there's, I mean, the Electoral College twice in my lifetime has given the election to not the winner of the popular vote. There's, the filibuster, which leads to minorities having an outstanding power to block legislation. There's, the results of the 2000 election by the decision of the Supreme Court not to do the recount. There's all the ways in which, as you wrote about through the 90s and more, voting procedures were designed to disenfranchise. And then there's the more kind of deep parts of it, of corporations undermining, just any civil society organization at all that would allow people to express their needs, to kind of form a collective will to really participate. And so all that in some ways has been like kind of ordinary parts of life for a while. And what is so, but also like within a set of bounds and kind of a at least rhetorical commitment to, say, believing the results of elections. Something has shifted in the present, and it's sort of hard to figure out. I guess my question to you almost is, why? Like, what, it seems to me elites have been doing kind of fine with the system as it's been for 40 years. So why radicalize asking questions about, the integrity of the processes themselves? Why allow kind of leader cult-like figures to arise? Like, how? Yeah, I guess it's sort of like, why wasn't sort of ordinary anti-democracy good enough for?
I think that's the question. I think that's exactly the question. And maybe the answer is that greed can lead to incredible overreaching. And this overreaching, I don't think we can be confident that by neoliberal elites overreaching that we'll get social democracy, but we'll for sure get disorder. And they don't like that. And yet they can't quite control all of their troops, can they? It's not clear that they're acting in unison and with discipline. If they were, would they have swerved to support Trump? This strikes me as nuts. Because Trump couldn't plan this. I mean, this is not a very smart man. This is a man who acts out of his gut. He didn't plan to take over the United States. I don't think he even planned to run for president. I think that was sort of an accident. But he likes it. He likes to eat. He likes to take. He likes to grab.
I wonder how speaking of Trump, and one thing that interested me about the 2020 election that maybe is worth talking about is, the 2020 election, on all accounts, was one of the highest participation elections in a long time in the United States, which is interesting and in some ways heartening. Again, very insane that in the United States, that could still be a close election when very clearly, like, the popular majority went one way, and but it was still a close election because of whatever 3 swing states and the Electoral College. But I also am curious, I feel like a lot of your work on voting and the emphasis on elites using procedural barriers to vote is the idea that sort of were working people, poor people, able to participate in the system, their politics would lean redistributive, would lean towards chastening the power of elites. What's interesting about this last high participation election is that, it wasn't like a landslide, and the new groups that were brought into politics did not seem to go all in one direction or another. They seem to be kind of fairly split in the same way the population, the whatever 2016 or 2012 voting population was split. So I'm curious how that affects your thinking about some of these questions.
Well, I think that raises a very interesting question, especially for you, Jeremy, now that you've become a democratic socialist. Who is the working class? Because we're always talking about the working class. What is the working, does the working class, does it really harbor an ideology that would give us a democratic socialist society? That's always been the idea, isn't it? And is it true? No, well, the evidence is, I think, very mixed. On the one hand, it's quite clear that the Trump constituency is sort of looks like we've been describing the working class, doesn't it? It's a little bit better off, but not that much. On the other hand, there's also evidence from survey data that white working class voters are responsive to liberal proposals with regard to bread and butter issues. They are also, at least in surveys, they're also responsive to decent racial positions, that they're nothing like the crazies who ran down the streets with torches in Charleston. So it reminds me of Lenin's argument that the working class by itself would not bring us communism, but it had to be the party, the political party, the Communist Party, organizing the working class. That was what we had to aim for. I'm not making that argument, but I'm rather invoking the argument as something to contemplate.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, it leads me to think about one other thing that I briefly came to before, and I'm curious how you think about when thinking about kind of people getting together. I mean, on the one hand, it seems pretty clear that we're living through a period of movements. When I teach your work, obviously a lot of the students I think here, and we'll more time in the discussion talk about it, are thinking about the uprising for racial justice of last summer. But also, the Black Lives Matter is also started during the Obama administration. There was Occupy. There was a kind of movement style presidential campaign for Bernie Sanders. And that's just in the US. Like, there are movements all over the place. Chile finally got rid of its Pinochet constitution, or the movements in East Asia, the Umbrella movement and others. And I'm curious, but it definitely does seem that a lot of these movements are, unlike, say, something like the civil rights movement, where there were some pretty clear organizations at the heart of it, and a kind of leadership group and an ideology. A lot of these movements are kind of rougher around the edges, and it's kind of unclear how much stickiness they have over time. And I'm just curious what you think about that, as someone who's kind of thought a lot about spontaneity versus organization and movements, and also like how you think building movements in kind of more atomized, disconnected times generally, like how does that look? Because it seems also true that just like society is less organized in a deep way in our period.
Well, I think that you may be influenced too much by a kind of exaggerated history of how the working class emerged in the 20th century, where there's a kind of celebration of working class communities, working class towns, and unions that could benefit from the cohesion that working class communities had already developed. I think that there is a tendency when we don't win, or we don't win right away, or when the struggle is hard, or when we get discouraged, to say that we have to organize, we have to find the solution in a kind of magic formula for how to organize. And I don't know about that. I don't think there's that historically, a lot of the great movements did not have formulas for organization, but the organization, a lot of the organization was what you might call spontaneous. People had common backgrounds, common problems. They recognized the problems, and they recognized the people who were responsible for the problems, and they struck out at them. And they didn't win everything, but they won things. They won unions. They won higher wages, a bigger share of productivity. They won what they wanted, which was they won little houses with white picket fences. We criticize that, but that people want that. And if you look at the survey data, they want it still. They want the bread and butter issues that the labor movement won over the course of the late 19th and 20th century. So I think we have to be very cautious, because there's a problem with unions or with organization too. We all recognize that the great weapon of the working class is the strike, don't we? Everybody knows that. Everybody agrees with that. But unions,
union leadership, but
what? What'd you say, Jeremy?
I said except most union leadership, but
yeah. Well, that's right. That strikes, there's something I said somewhere, I wrote it somewhere, that strikes give us unions, because when workers are aroused, fiery, ready to take on the boss is really looking around for some way to get control of these people. And lo and behold, the way to get control of them is to recognize a union and give the union a contract with a no strike clause. That's the big periods of unionization followed the periods of of worker uprisings, of worker walkouts, of worker strikes. So but then unions, we have a union. The union doesn't want to strike, or probably doesn't want to strike. That's not, you have to be a little bit cautious, because there are amazing unions. And anyway, I'd rather have a union than have a boss. But unions do not, by and large, like to take the risks of the strike. And I think that there's a certain amount of brain work that has to be done trying to figure out the kinds of organization that will encourage militancy, disruption, strikes, walkouts, boycotts, because those are the weapons of the many. Those are the weapons of working people. And if our organizations don't like those weapons because of the risks that they carry with them, then we're in trouble.
I agree. I see some hands are starting to go up, so maybe we should open it
Sure.
up. And I have some more questions, but I'll come back in. I'll start taking stack, meaning if you would like to get in line, you're welcome to either put your hand up as Tom did, or just write in the chat as I'm doing now, stack. Yeah, we will open it up to some questions. So I saw Tom Hoon first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Francis. I wanted to go back to your question earlier, Francis, about sort of who wins in a democracy. And I think my sense is, in part, US democracy is founded on a balance of powers. And that means that in the end, we don't want any one party or any one cabal or any one sect to win. And that means that there will always be struggle. And so when we think about, well, what's different about this struggle? Two things come to mind for me. One is, because your work is on disenfranchisement and the vote, it seems to me that the strategy of the Republican Party is not only to take the vote away from people. I think the Republican Party would also like people to feel disenfranchised, because my sense is that a lot of the followers of the Republican Party are people who feel disenfranchised. And so the base of the Republican Party now is people feeling like their vote doesn't matter. And so it strikes me that the strategy of the Republicans is to make more people feel as if their vote doesn't count. And that makes them thereby more available for a different kind of messaging. And this is the part that seems to me that's really problematic in our democracy just now. Is one would have imagined that if we increase the possibility of communication through the internet and social media and so on, and we increase the possibility of connection through Facebook, I can imagine the founding fathers would have never imagined that more communication and more connection could have anything negative, any negative consequences. But in fact, communication and connection have been weaponized. Just as Tocqueville points out, equality looks like it's an all good thing, and yet there's all kinds of negative consequences to equality. Conformism, increased feeling of competitiveness among citizens, and so on. So I don't think it's that the Republicans simply want to take votes away. I think they also want to sort of inflame this feeling of disenfranchisement, because that then, as you said very early on, that then delegitimizes the whole project of democracy. Yeah, so I'm curious what you might make of that.
Well, what your comments remind me of another theme that we haven't talked about and that we should talk about, which is the rise of authoritarianism in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And it would not be correct to say that the many have been stalwarts in resisting the rise of authoritarianism. The picture is, I think, very mixed. We've already said that the Trump supporters, who are authoritarians, the Trump supporters they won elections. There are a lot of them. And there seems to be a lot of support around the world for authoritarian and charismatic leaders. What is fueling that? You know, we on the left, and I consider myself a person on the left, are always trying to explain that in terms of economic hardship. People turn to authoritarian leaders when they experience economic uncertainty or hardship. Is that an adequate answer? I don't think so. I think that we have to give more weight to the content of authoritarian appeals. I'll tell you one thing that crosses my mind repeatedly as I watch the news over the last couple of years. And that is, you're not going to like this. The cruelty exhibited by the right seems to be very appealing to a lot of people. They like it. They like it like adolescent boys like killing cats. So I don't think that the success of these authoritarians in the United States is out of the question. Do you?
No, I don't. But I also, to sort of repeat the theme of the disenfranchised, I think that authoritarians look more attractive the more powerless an individual feels. And so the project of disenfranchisement sort of induces the feeling that the authoritarian looks like the solution to.
But I don't know. So the more powerless I feel, your idea is that makes me want to glom onto a powerful figure in some way. Is that the idea?
Maybe not you specifically, but just as you say, it looks like cruelty is appealing to people. I think for emotionally, psychologically, for many people, the response to a feeling of vulnerability or weakness is to look for strength or an image of strength somewhere, regardless how stupid that figure might be.
Yeah.
That strength. I mean, remember when people are polled and asked, what is the number one term that comes to mind, the people who admire Trump, their answer is his authenticity. Now that strikes many of us as exactly the wrong thing. But authenticity, I think, for many people looks something like you get to say whatever the hell you want. It looks like it's an expression of power, right? He has the ability he has the power to be authentic. And that's what's admirable, regardless the content of his cruelty, his misogyny, and so on. I don't know how else to explain it, because I agree with you entirely. I don't think on economic grounds we can really explain the appeal for authoritarian figures.
So you think it's because events have made people feel weak and helpless, so they're attracted to authoritarian solutions?
I think especially with the pandemic also, I think we feel more vulnerable than we have in quite a long time. And so the appeal of an authority figure is greater for many, but not for all.
And just, I would say, to put in like two cheers for economic hardship, I mean, part of that I do think is at least economic, i.e. like seeing, again, like the first generation in history or in modern history where it's likely that, its children will do worse economically than it's doing. I mean, the sense of just like an erosion of security, hope, faith in the future, these kinds of things, which I think have at least some economic element.
Yeah, but your description of the economic element is very close to what Tom is describing as helplessness. And if you think about it, this susceptibility to authoritarian leaders and appeals may have to do with a kind of concatenation of developments that makes people feel uncertain and helpless. I think that is an argument that I would buy right away. Think about it. First, there's the pandemic. Now, epidemics make people go crazy historically. I mean, they see witches and all sorts of magic as the reason that people are dropping like flies. And in this case, in our case, this kind of the craziness makes them resist what you might call enlightenment solutions to the pandemic. Witch doctors tell them that if you drink this horse medicine, you'll be protected from the pandemic. And that makes them resist vaccines or masks or doctors lecturing to them. So, but that's just one element in the situation. Another is the economy is changing in ways that people don't feel they have any grasp on. And I mean, they grew up thinking that, well, they would get a job, something like their father's job or their mother's job, but maybe a little bit better, would pay a little bit better, but it'd be similar. And they get a little house and they'd have kids and they work hard and send the kids to community college. But they don't know if they're going to get a job or if the kid's going to get a job or what kind of job it's going to be, or if the industry in which they worked will still exist when their kid comes of age. It's very, very uncertain. And not only is, as Jeremy said, not only is the economy uncertain, but the planet is uncertain. I mean, I watch the news and I see the wildfires out of control. What's the name of the town that burned to the ground in California? Paradise. The water's rising, people slogging through water that is up to their chest to get to dry land. Is that going to stop? No. Is it going to go back? The waters are going to recede, but something else is going to happen. The whole island that you're living on is going to be underwater. What else is crazy? Well, the pandemic itself, I think everybody or almost everybody knows that the general idea explaining the pandemics, and it's not just COVID, it's also HIV, it's a lot of new diseases, that the idea is that economic development has brought centers of population in contact with pathogens that we've never been exposed to. Now, that's not going to go away. It could get worse. It will get worse if that's the explanation. Well, no, we have science, but we also have people who are so deluded, who are so nuts that they're going to try to shut down the science. All right, what should we do? What should we do? What do you think we should do?
I don't have an answer to that, but maybe we take some student questions. I mean, I feel like your answer to that is social movements.
Yes, it still is, but I don't know if they'll succeed. I'm not making any promises, but if you don't try, you might as well just roll over now.
The Pascal's wager on social movements.
All right, let's have some comments or questions.
Yeah, Sam is on stack. Go ahead, Sam.
Hey, so I appreciate what you guys been talking about the causes of people to kind of embrace authoritarians or shift to authoritarian ideology, and a lot of that is uncertainty. So that kind of brings the question to mind, are we also then in danger of an authoritarian coming from the Democratic Party? I mean, surely Democratic voters will feel just as uncertain in the future and now. And would it be possible that, you know, a charismatic and no nonsense kind of leader with the same kind of authoritarian ideology could rise up in that sense as well? Like,
Sure.
what separates the
Well, these political parties are not very sturdy ideologically, so I don't think, look at how quickly the Republican Party became an authoritarian party or a sort of proto-fascist party, is in my judgment. So of course a democratic leader could also become an authoritarian leader. What I don't understand, and I don't, maybe you do, and you could tell us all, what I don't understand is why there hasn't been more resistance from American, well-established, deeply rooted American corporate elites, more resistance to the nuttiness of this, what's the name of this guy in the Congress who used cartoons to kill AOC, or Trump himself, or, I mean, they, as somebody in the group said already, they were doing so well, but they wanted even more. That may have been a mistake. It sounds like something that the Aztecs might have done. And, you know, they did destroy their sources of protein. So we may do that too.
I see Alicette on stack.
So you pose a lot of interesting questions and statements and charge us all with a lot of things. And I'm talking, I suppose, as a Latina, as a Puerto Rican, as a person of color, and I know that I am white, but I'm Puerto Rican, born and raised. The thing here is, and I'm speaking to authoritarianism, and I also need to inform, my studies were in Latin American studies, so I'm very entrenched in authoritarianism in Latin America. Latinos are very receptive to that, even if they run away. And we do or are receptive to patriarchal craziness like that, even if we run away. And so in times of severe crisis, Trump being the psycho that he is, he resonates. He resonates even with traditional democratic Latinos. And we saw this happen in the election. And Democrats didn't do their due diligence. They didn't use reason, they didn't use words, and Trump just made them feel seen. And so I feel like basic logic is being missed with communicating. You can't just say, Trump is a psycho, vote for us, and think that the job is done.
What should they say?
See, this is what I resent as a person of color and as a Latina. That's not my job. The job of other people, if you want our vote, is to tell us, help us. I'm not here to give a key because we have so many issues, and the same thing for Black people and Asian people. We have a multitude of things. We're on fire with problems. And it's sort of like, you want us when there's a vote, and then that's it. Then we get put on a shelf. So that's my point. Trump resonated because everyone felt seen and touched. I think this man is a cancer in the universe, but I can understand as a person who's learned. I mean, even amongst my scholar friends who are radical liberals off the deep end are sitting here saying, I miss when Giuliani was here in New York. Do you know how crazy that is?
That is crazy.
It is crazy, but this is not uncommon for socialist leaning Democrats to be saying this right now because of how the streets of New York are today. So this is just a comment in relation to everything that you're saying. So what do we do? Because we can say this, but all these things are just air. There's a solution. We can't fret our hands at Trump because he exists. And the thing is that he's not the scary mofo. It's the next guy and the next guy and the next guy, because they're just gonna come, they're gonna keep on. It's like water. They found an avenue and now it's coming.
I agree with that. It's not just Trump. And in fact, Trump is an oddball because I don't think he has a plan excepting for his own re-election. I don't think he has a plan to reorganize American society or American political life.
Stack is open. It does occur to me in relationship to that. I mean, I think one interesting thing, one sort of heartening thing about the Trump years was just how much mobilization in general there was, like mass protests, really just like astounding amount actually of people being out on the streets. And again, I do feel like we're sort of living through a period of like much greater mobilization. On the other hand, some of the difficulties of the current situation, I think governmentally, and why I think, as Alicette was saying, the votes in 2020 looked the way they did in part, and also like, say Biden's approval rating and other things, has to do with like the resistance is not actually a governing coalition in American society, given American governmental, like all the barriers towards forming governments that exist in this society. And it has like a lot of unstable elements, and those elements that are trying to put forth like bold policies to change things in order to try to meet some of the need are like not actually in control.
I don't disagree with that, but on the other hand, Jeremy, the movements, and it has been a movement moment, the movements help explain the extraordinary initiatives that Biden did take. Look, I study social welfare policies. You don't get big redistributive policies unless there's a big problem that has to be solved. That's what Black Lives Matter did. It created the problem, and Biden responded to it. Do you know what it would take with advocacy groups and policy experts and little lobbyists like you and me to get something like the Biden a child tax credit. That's incredible. It happened in the United States. It happened overnight. So, and it happened on top of other relief programs having to do with the pandemic. So, you know, the American welfare programs have not really significantly changed since the Great Society. And they didn't change that much in the Great Society, truth to tell. There were some innovative developments like giving money to local groups that hadn't been done before, but by and large, the expenditures in the Great Society were not massive, but these were. So maybe we're looking at the thing just from one kind of perspective. We want to see signs of social democracy or something like that, the outlines of a solution, and we don't see that. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that some of these initiatives are amazing. Amazing. And people are going to be, life is going to be better for these people that get those grants. That's going to be a big difference. And maybe what we should fight for, what going forward, we should support those programs because they won't last if we don't. So we have to support those programs. We have to do something to ensure Medicare stays alive. It's a very good program. No program is perfect because you didn't design it, they did. But there have been changes in American society that we had wished for and that we have to defend and improve. And we can do that. And as I said a few minutes ago, the survey data show that people do like these programs. They like bread and butter programs, and they especially like it if you don't try to dress them up as, you know, the beginnings of socialism or something like that. They are the beginnings of socialism, but you don't have to talk about them that way.
Yeah, I totally agree. Stack is open. I will just say, I think, you know, in a lot of ways, both of the parties are, I think, post-neoliberal now, for better or for worse, which is interesting.
What does that mean, post-neoliberal?
Well, just like the reigning ideas that have been the, you know, the bread and butter of politics in the US for the last 40 years, which is like, you know, government is bad, markets are great, sit back and relax and let the market reward who's deserving and who's not. I don't think either party believes that at this point, like at least the leadership of the parties. And that is very interesting. I mean, it, you know, again, interesting maybe in the sense of the, you know, old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. But
it is interesting that the Republicans have not attacked the programs using the weaponry of their ideology. They have not. Or if they've done it, it's been sort of sotto voce. They have not done it in a loud voice.
yeah, and there's certainly some people in the Democrats who are attempting it, but it's a minority view. I mean, a very small, a powerful minority maybe, but it's not like where the party is, which is interesting.
That's true. Manchin and Sinema are only two people. It's amazing. Where did the other right-wing Democrats go? They stayed quiet, basically. It's interesting.
I see Sage on Stack. Go ahead, Sage.
I know. So I ask this question a lot because it always really confuses me in terms of So like, well, as you said, that things like Medicare and other programs of social and economic support, they need to exist, and they're like present Band-Aid solutions to being able to support people that are being disenfranchised. Something that I really don't know how to work around if it was brought up is the effect of nuclear weapons on our country. So at least until 2003, it was entirely a single integrated operational plan where the president was able to completely and one-off control nukes. And so while it's a little bit more seceded now, so it would be harder for Trump to have done that if it was possible, I feel like if we were to go to a more extreme, to the point where someone like the wealthy and powerful in this country, where we would fight for basically for social democracy and support, and then you could just say, we'll nuke you. Like, how are you supposed to, I don't know. Like, I know it's a theoretical, but I feel like I don't know what I would do in that situation, especially because it's something that's completely out of my reach or anybody else's besides the wealthy and powerful.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. You don't
Yeah.
know.
It has to do, so it's about the threat of nuclear annihilation in terms of the wealthy and powerful controlling the means of this annihilation. So like, what would stop them from employing that to go against social revolution?
Did you notice that Bernie Sanders voted against the defense appropriations? That was kind of amazing. Nobody votes against defense, and he did. I don't know, that's something to think about, how the prospects for a kind of anti-war movement. Why not? You have a Green New Deal that's like an anti-war movement. It's a movement against annihilation.
I'll post in the chat. There's an interesting op-ed from The Guardian recently about how for social programs, if you cut a certain amount from modernizing nuclear infrastructure, it would give lots of money available for social programs in the US. So relevant on that. Stack is open.
Well,
Sam, is it okay, friend, to take maybe one or two more?
sure.
Sam, go ahead again.
I wanted to hear your thoughts about the relationship between the masses and, like, I guess for a simpler word, like the police, like the enforcement class of people, because I've always been so shocked as to the hostility that like law enforcement has towards social movements when they're essentially the same economic and social class. Like, your average policeman does not have much more money or much more power, like political power, than the average, factory worker that strikes, but he'll still ride in on a horse and club the guy over the head. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and if it's purely like a propaganda thing that people are being set upon each other or demonized, or if there's something more involved.
I think you've fastened on a very interesting institution that helps to explain popular politics in the United States. The invention of the police, and it had to be invented in the 19th century, was invented in England. And it was in the wake of a series of conflicts between the English rural working class and the yeomen, or the sort of middle level farmers in Manchester. The conflicts produced a lot of bloodshed, and all of England was stunned by what had happened. In the wake of those conflicts, or that conflict, the English developed the first domestic police. They recruited people from the rural working class to be police and to police the rural working class. It's exactly as you say. But people are people. And if you pit one group of people against another group of people, and you tell the first group of people, you are the whites, and you're going to attack the blues. And here, that's your paycheck and your arms. Listen, we set soldiers to go and kill people who are really just like them in another country, in a third world country. And people do it, and they learn to hate the ones they have to kill. And they learn to hate them in part because they're killing them, and in part because they're afraid of being killed themselves. And that's what happens to people who work on the police.
If there's any other student questions, Sean, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for being here. So one thing that I think is great just about this community that we're in here tonight on this Zoom recording is that we're all artists, so we have like this great ability to like incite change through our work potentially, if that's the route we kind of choose to go. And one of the philosophies that you write about in the nature of disruptive power is like disruption as a whole, right? And like through kind of protests and mass organization, like people are able to kind of return power to themselves through this way. But bringing it back to just art as a whole, in the modern sense, I feel like just because through the internet and through social media, the power and the weight and like the meaning of just images has greatly diminished because we're exposed to so many. And it doesn't have the same effect that political art had in, say, like the late 20th century. So what ways do you see, if you see any, that we can use art to kind of aid this disruption and kind of like reassert the integrity of democracy in a way that's meaningful, but also like unique in a sense that it stands out from the hundreds of thousands of images that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, and so it doesn't get obscured by them?
I don't share your opinion that the effectiveness of art has diminished. I think that people are exposed to art more through more media, and a more educated public is more open to it. I think that, I'm kind of ignorant, but what I know of political art makes me a big fan, and I think it's very effective. So I can't answer your question because I don't share the premise that you as an artist are losing the ability to communicate with an audience. I think you have that ability, and I want to cheer you on.
Thank you. But to answer just in terms of like the content, what content do you think is meaningful in a way to kind of like bolster, buttress these social movements?
Well,
I mean, is it like satirical, or is that the best route?
well, I'm not sure. I know, because I haven't thought about that question. But I think the content should show the experience of people who, as a result of your everyday activities, you would not know about that experience. But that's always been the most compelling art to me. That's why I like the art produced in the 1930s, for example, because these are people, they're my brothers and sisters, and I did not know how they lived or what they dreamed about. I did not know, and you showed it to me. And I thank you for that.
I think that's a note to end on. A great question and a great response. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you. I love talking to you.